Ah, Ethiopia. People rarely think about your history, and for the fans here, probably three things come to mind. Firstly, that you get to play Haile Selassie in the Civilization games with them. Secondly, that it's the origin of lots of crude jokes you probably shouldn't say on first dates. And thirdly, that lots of potheads make lots of great music praising it as Zion. But this doesn't really give Ethiopia's rich history justice. It's one of the very few sub-Saharan African countries that has a truly ancient history, likely going back to around 1000 BC, and it's been a Christian nation for nearly 2,000 years, and was the only African country to be able to fight off Western imperialism at the end of the 19th century. And around 500 AD, Ethiopia was a powerful player in the region, being able to conquer Yemen and control the Red Sea trade. But however, for many different reasons, Ethiopia's power declined. And what if that had never happened? What if Ethiopia was able to expand its power rather than declining and become a truly powerful superpower? How would this affect the world? How would civilization, borders, history, and culture all change? That is the question of this alternate history. So the decline of Ethiopia happened for a series of reasons. Firstly, they militarily lost control of Yemen, which was their primary colony, because the Persians supported a native rebellion that kicked them out. And secondly, climate change. The medieval warm period that resulted in the north of Europe having a good climate that resulted in the flowering of medieval civilization and let the Vikings settle in Greenland had the adverse effect of making Ethiopia drier, and Ethiopia, which is already pretty arid, suffered quite a bit from this. And thirdly, and most importantly, the rise of Islam. In the 7th century, the Arabs poured out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered an empire stretching from Spain to Pakistan. And over time, they drove the Ethiopians from their strong trade positions on the coast of the Red Sea into the interior mountains of the Ethiopian highlands. And this cut the Ethiopians off from trade and made them economically and technologically stagnant. And the Ethiopians basically became black Armenians in that they were surrounded and under siege by aggressive Muslim nations for the next 1,500 years. And although things look bleak, there are ways we can keep Ethiopia a powerful nation. Firstly, climate change can work both ways for making empires. For example, the Mongols went out in their conquests partly because their homelands became drier due to the medieval warm period, and a big reason the Manchus invaded South into China in the 17th century was the mini ice age hit Manchuria terribly, and basically meant that they had to attack South to survive. Meanwhile, part of the reason I exist is that the mini ice age made Northern Europe colder and thus made migrating to North America more attractive during the early modern period. Also, the mini ice age sparked Europe's agricultural revolution, which really doesn't get enough credit for being one of the most important events in history that it really is. And so it's not hard to imagine that the drying out of the Ethiopian homeland could have also had the effect of making the Ethiopians want to conquer outwards and migrate to other areas. So I'm going to use my normal cheat code here and say the Ethiopians have around 100 years or 3 generations of good leadership, which would give them enough time to solidify themselves into a position of power. And so let's say the Ethiopians are able to win in Yemen and are able to buff up their fleet so that they can control the Red and Ethiopian seas. So when the Ethiopians were trying to take over the Arabian Peninsula, they besieged Mecca in 570, and the Prophet Muhammad had already been born by this point, and so he would still exist in this world. And medieval wars actually had surprisingly low casualty rates, so the statistical chances of him dying in this war as an infant are very low. And at the same time, just getting rid of Muhammad and Islam would make this timeline very messy, because it would square the length of this video to go into all the effects of that. And at the same time, I've already made a video about it, the link to which I hope you click after you're done with this video, and then you click on all the advertisements in both videos as well. But in general, if Muhammad still exists in this world, the Ethiopians aren't going to hold on to Mecca. Even if you're a raging anti-Islamist, you would have to admit that Muhammad was a remarkably charismatic, talented, and intelligent man. And I don't see any way that he would be fine with a foreign power controlling his homeland, and I don't see any way in which he would fail at liberating his homeland either. The Ethiopian Empire could still survive with Islam around. Just look at the Byzantines. And the Ethiopians would probably be fine as long as they held on to their coast. However, they'd probably have to give up Yemen for a few generations after the initial Arab invasions, but they'd be able to reconquer it once the locus of Muslim power moved away from Arabia towards Baghdad and Damascus in the north. As the Muslims become preoccupied with the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Empire eventually weakens so it can only really count on the Fertile Crescent, the Ethiopians are able to gain control over Oman and build trading settlements in what is now Somalia. Control over Oman would allow the Ethiopians a stranglehold over the trade in the Persian Gulf, which would mean they would control both termini of the Pearl Necklace, or the actually larger and much richer naval version of the Silk Road. This would make the Ethiopians fabulously wealthy. Basically, by this point, Ethiopia is good. They're sitting on one of the wealthiest trade routes in the world and quite stable in their power. The Muslim nations were too self-centered and self-absorbed by this point to be able to defeat them, and the Muslim world was in enormous disunity and wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight. The Ethiopians would start to solidify their control over the region, gaining control over the trade in Eastern Africa and turning Zanzibar, Mogadishu, and Mombasa into client states. They would trade heavily with India and especially Sri Lanka, which was the central entrepot of the Indian Ocean's trade. Having the most powerful player in this region be Christian would result in Christianity spreading throughout this region. Somalia and much of Eastern Africa would outright convert to Christianity, and there'd be large Christian minorities in Yemen and Oman, just enough to have nasty civil wars when they'd get independence, while meanwhile there would develop large Christian communities inside India and Sri Lanka. In general, in this era, all religions were respected in the trade in the Indian Ocean, and Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, and Zoroastrians trade with each other without much fuss or violence. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, some states would convert to Christianity and others would convert to Islam to play the Ethiopians off against Muslim merchants from areas like Persia and India. And so Indonesia would become a patchwork of Christian and Muslim states. This would make the Ethiopian patriarch a quite powerful figure, probably on par with the patriarchs in Constantinople and Russia, and it would make the Ethiopian Christian sect one of the largest in all of Christianity. And since the patriarchy would be more powerful in this world, we would expect to have cooler office spaces. Although the Ethiopians would be a quite powerful force in the Indian Ocean, they would likely fail at colonizing the interior of Africa. This is because until 100 years ago, tropical Africa was basically deadly for outsiders due to the diseases involved, and the reason the Ethiopians had an advanced civilization in the first place was because they lived in the mountains, which basically gave them a climate 1,000 miles to the north of what it should have been, and this meant they could have an urban society without having diseases wreck them. Before the Muslim conquests, the Aksumite or Ethiopian state was mostly based along the coast in what is now Eritrea and Djibouti, as well as in the north of Ethiopia, and the Ethiopians went into much of what is now Ethiopia because the Muslims drove them off the coast, and this would likely still happen in this timeline, as Ethiopian farmers would push further into the interior to get more land. I could also see the Ethiopians expanding into the mountains of central Kenya, which have a climate that's not dissimilar to that of Ethiopia. This would expand the Ethiopian hinterland, meaning that they could have a larger population base for armies as well as taxes, which would solidify their power over the non-Ethiopian parts of the empire. Sudan, meanwhile, would likely remain a buffer state between the Ethiopians and the also quite powerful Egyptians to the north, while meanwhile Africa to the south of Ethiopia would likely just have a climate too dissimilar to Ethiopia for the Ethiopians to colonize. The Ethiopians would be able to maintain this position of dominance for quite a long time. Neither the Mamelukes nor the Persians to the north were very navally focused, and they'd be fine with Ethiopians controlling these trade routes as long as they weren't too rapacious middlemen. And so the Ethiopians would have a pretty good gig running the trade at the ends of the Pearl/Silk Road, as well as having a veritable monopoly on the Middle East slave trade with Africa. When the Ottomans would show up, they'd be so far away from their supply centers in Egypt or in Turkey, and so they'd likely just give up and let the Ethiopians hold on to the bottom part of the Arabian Peninsula and Red Sea. This would continue until the Portuguese would arrive in this region around 1500. The Europeans had an enormous advantage over basically everyone else in the high seas, since they used cannons on wheels so the recoil wouldn't destroy the vessels. This meant that they could use a huge amount of cannons compared to their enemies. This combined with the discovery of bureaucratic warfare gave Western Europe an enormous military advantage over the rest of the world. The Ethiopians likely wouldn't be able to keep up and their naval dominance of the region would be crushed. I'm not being harsh here, I'm just being realistic. Only a handful of countries, almost all of them in Western Europe, with the weird exceptions of Russia and Japan, figured out bureaucratic warfare, and anyone who did not was basically militarily crushed. You could say the Portuguese wouldn't attack the Ethiopians because they were both Christians, but in general, the early Portuguese explorers in this region were rapacious thugs who didn't care about much besides money, and had far more in common with the Vikings than with any respectable merchants today. And so, in this world, they would shatter the Ethiopians' naval dominance, and the disparate regions of the empire, like Oman and Yemen, would split off, with their major ports becoming owned by the Portuguese. As the 19th century would come along and Europe would get really into colonization in this region, the Ethiopians would be humiliated like all the other proud non-European empires like the Ottomans and the Chinese, and the outlying parts of the empire would be directly colonized by the Europeans, while meanwhile the empire's heartland, just like in our world, would remain in indigenous hands. Just that heartland would be larger in this world. In the 20th and 21st centuries, I'm honestly not sure if Ethiopia would have industrialized like China or Japan, or if it would have failed like Iraq or Syria. It's honestly impossible to tell. If Whatifalthist was in the year 1500, and a time traveler from the future came to me and said that Western Christendom would have an enormous technological renaissance that would take over the world, but there would be two non-Western European nations that would also be able to catch up and play the same game, and I had to guess which ones, I would probably guess the Turks and the Persians and be wrong and have the real answer be the Japanese and the Russians. I frankly would have guessed those two Muslim countries because the Muslims and the Christians had been on technological parity for hundreds of years. In that year, the Turks were the most advanced military in Europe, had a really advanced economy, and were one of the most tolerant peoples in the world. And if the Turks had that technology, so would the Persians. Those would all be valid reasons, but I would still be wrong. I would have entirely overlooked Russia, and Japan makes some sense if you look at their social structure, which in outline wasn't that different from Western Europe's, but I probably would have overlooked that. And so I really have no idea if Ethiopia would rise to become an East African superpower, dragging all its neighbors upwards with it, or if it would have stayed in the ground like Syria or Iraq. As of this moment in our world, Ethiopia has an advancing economy and is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, actually. But it's hard to say if this will continue, because in many cases there are third world countries that do quite well for a short span, but then fall apart because they don't have the civic institutions to perpetuate it. But I don't know if Ethiopia is one of those nations or not, and we'll have to wait 20 years to figure it out. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, stay tuned for more videos, tell a friend, or give me $1,000 on Patreon. Each of those are all equally good except the last one. And as always, thank you so much, and have a great day.